Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Today we have a guest I've wanted to get on here for a very long time. He's one of the most interesting economists and intellectuals out there. William Easterly is a professor emeritus of economics at New York University and co-director emeritus of the NYU Development Research Institute. He's the author of several books, including The Tyranny of Experts and The White Man's Burden. And he's published a zillion of peer-reviewed academic articles and written op-eds in all the usual fancy places. Professor Easterly, thanks for coming on the Remnant.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, as per tradition, I should say, you have a new book out called Violent Saviors. What's your book about?
Jonah, let me start with where the book came from. I've been observing as a development economist for many years that there's this concept of benevolent autocrats, benevolent dictators, in which if a dictator happens to have a lot of economic growth on his watch, he's presumed to be benevolent. So somebody like Meles Zenawi, the dictator of Ethiopia from the 90s through 2012, did have high economic growth in Ethiopia and is presumed to be a benevolent guy and got praise from the likes of Bill Gates and Susan Rice. And yet, Meles Zenawi was also at the same time putting political protesters in jail, shooting them down the streets, marching farmers away from their villages at gunpoint to government-run villages. And something bothered me about this, that we don't seem to have a good way of talking about violence and the violations of individual political and economic rights in development. We just give, unblemished approval to anyone who produces high GDP growth. So I thought, I'm struggling to have a good response to this. I think I need help. Unfortunately, help was available from 250 years of economists who had been responding to another kind of claim of benevolent autocracy, which was Western colonialism and conquest in the name of progress. They've been happening since the 1600s and the conquest of the New World, which the conquerors argued was actually in the interests of the conquered, the Native Americans. It was also used to justify conquest in India, which Adam Smith fiercely criticized, and later conquest and forced development of Africa, and the 20th century forced development of the Soviet Union under the tyrants of Lenin and Stalin. So, fortunately, economists have been thinking about this all this time and formulating a response. And I was eager to get their help in deciding how to answer this issue today in modern economic development. And that's what the book does. It goes through this 250 years or even longer in some cases of how economists promoting liberal values, and I mean liberal in the sense of classical liberalism in the 19th century that prizes individual freedom. And they have formulated a response to these claims of benevolent conquest. And I learned a lot from that, and I was able to distill that history in this book.
So let's talk about a little bit about the connective tissue between benevolent despots and benevolent invaders or violent saviors or whatnot. I've read some of your stuff on this point, and I find it very helpful in thinking about these things in the sense that there's this amazing history of sort of power worship that says if a leader is successfully using their power according to some metric, that therefore they're good at their job, right? And I understand and sympathize greatly with your problems with that. At the same time, how do you respond when people say, "Look at all the good that Lee Kuan Yew has done"? Right? I mean, is benevolent dictator or benevolent autocrat a contradiction in terms, or is it a spectrum where there are some people who fit the description a little better than your blanket condemnation, and some people deserve the blanket condemnation?
Yeah, I think it is true that, say, for example, and I actually confirmed this in formal research study that I did that got published recently. Lee Kuan Yew, it does seem he deserves credit for very high economic growth in Singapore. And, most people would say that's a good thing. And I certainly believe other things equal. Big rises in GDP per capita and decrease in material poverty are good things. But the radical solution that the liberal economists offered was that material progress alone is not enough to justify what's going on. They had this idea that you should define progress not by some objective indicator like GDP per capita, but by the choices of those who are the intended beneficiaries of this supposed progress. So if the beneficiaries of supposed progress, showed signs of violent resistance or did not accept what they're being offered, and that for the liberal economists was enough to discredit that progress. Let me give you a really extreme example. A lot of the liberal thinkers, from beginning with Adam Smith and continuing all the way down to our own day with Amartya Sen, confronted an extreme claim that slavery was actually benevolent, because they argued, and some economic historians agreed with this, that may have in some cases produced a higher level of material consumption for slaves than was true for some comparison group still in Africa or in the white working class at the time. And yet the liberals did not choose to respond by disputing the claim of material benefits. They said instead, if this is so great, why are slaves trying so desperately to run away? Why are they running away from your supposed benevolence? And, Lincoln was also very sarcastic about that during the Civil War. If slavery is so great, why do the slaves resist it so much? And for that matter, if slavery is so great, why do you slave owners not want slavery for yourself?
Right.
That's the kind of liberal critique based on consent. That sounds really obvious to us today, but it's actually a kind of a radical rethinking of progress. The progress is not going to be defined by some outside indicator that outside experts can evaluate, like GDP per capita or material consumption. It's going to be defined by the choices of the people that are supposedly the beneficiaries of progress. If there's material progress without their consent, we really don't know that that's progress at all. And if there's material progress with consent, then yes, we can celebrate that.
I want to come back to that point in the role of agency and how to think about agency. But this book is more of a straightforward history than some of your other books in ways that I like.
Yes.
And so I guess one question I would have is, savior is a very religious term. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about are metrics, GDP per capita and whatnot. Clearly, a lot of the colonial stuff, the original justifications had less to do with material prosperity for their own good than for saving their souls for their own good. When and how does that transition, if that's right, when and how does that transition happen? When do we stop talking about, bringing the word to the savages and instead bringing, the automobile and medicine to the savages?
Yeah, these claims of development, you're completely right. Christianity was definitely part of the justification for the conquest. But actually, it happens very early on that there are also claims of material benefits. Let me read you a quote. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in 1629 was writing a prospectus for would-be settlers and funders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he addressed those who might be troubled in their consciences by the idea of taking away Indian lands. And John Winthrop reassured them. He said, after we take their land, they will, quote, learn from us to improve what land they have left. Such development advice will, quote, yield them more benefit than all that land which we have from them. So this is a claim of material salvation in addition to Christian salvation. That bringing the European English expertise on agriculture would generate large material benefits for the Indians that would more than compensate them for the land that the colonists and conquerors took away from them. This is a very specific claim, and it's reiterated over and over again for the next 400 years, which I track out in great detail. And this you can think of it as sort of a development right of conquest. If you presume that you are bringing progress to the lands you're conquering, you have a right to conquer those lands. If you claim you are bringing progress to the people you're conquering, then you have a right to conquer those people. And of course, the same liberal skeptical critique, applies in that case. Why did the Pequot Indians in the 1630s so fiercely resist Winthrop's supposed benevolence? Why was he required to impose his benevolence by massacring the Pequots and practically exterminating them as a distinct group? Now, it is true that 4 centuries later, the few surviving remnants of the Pequots have a high material standard of living. But clearly in the 1630s, the Pequots were not accessing to this deal that, okay, we give up our land and we're willing to be massacred for the sake of our own material progress and those of our descendants. So this is sort of the central liberal critique over and over again. If it's so great, why do you have to use violence to impose your salvation on the people you claim to be saving in material terms? And if it's so great, why would you not be willing to be conquered yourself by some other violent savior who can claim to bring you development?
So how do you think about, the Roman model, which the Spanish used to some extent, and I guess maybe the Brits did as well, but of basically co-opting the indigenous elites and ruling through them as your proxies, right? So on the one hand, the elites, they're getting bought off. But that provides kind of at least a facade of agency. Is your benchmark then, so long as the masses don't rise up? Because I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not trying to justify any of this stuff. I'm just trying to think it through. If there are going to be circumstances where you have rival elites, this happened a lot throughout the history of Europe, where one or certainly Caesar's conquest, one set of elites in Gaul signs up with Caesar. Caesar then helps make them more powerful. The other set of elites don the mantle of authentic indigenous sort of nationalist resistance against the foreign interlopers. But what it really is, not to sound too Douglas Northy, but it really is, it's just a fight between competing elites, and the invaders are one faction that makes one set of elites more powerful than the other. How do you actually parse out whether or not the resistance is an act of real, authentic, ground up agency and not one of these inter-elite fights?
Yeah, so I'm glad you're raising these complications. I think the liberal thinkers, including now myself, from writing this book in a very humble role in that lineup, they're much better at saying what's wrong than on how to fix it. That's consistent through the history of liberalism, including today. They're not offering some grand fix to rejiggering colonialism that will turn out to be okay after all by doing what you're saying, co-opting local elites or whatever. They're just saying, your ridiculous presumption that you're actually doing people good by conquering them, as opposed to you're just acting in your own self-interest. You want land for yourself. You want land for your settlers and colonists. And that's what's motivating you. So the liberals are offering this critique. We don't trust your self-interest to not act in your own for your own sake. We don't trust you to supposedly act for the sake of someone else. That's the basic critique of kind of colonial violence. And so the only answer there is don't be violent, don't conquer under this pretext. If you've already conquered, then how do we have a transition path from that to some better solution today? Those are much more complicated questions. So liberals are really kind of operating at the first level. Don't justify violence in the name of progress. It violates the liberal value of giving everyone an equality of rights. And that's really the second very important point. The Romans were operating at a time when nobody had freedom. Nobody had either collective right to consent to the consent of the governed or individual freedom in which people's political and economic and property rights were protected. So it doesn't do any good to have equal rights if the first group doesn't have rights to begin with. What's notable about the West is operating in a time when, especially England, did start to have freedom in economic and political terms for its own citizens. And so the liberals are saying, don't be hypocritical. Why do you want those rights for yourself, but you deny them to other people?
It's interesting. I've talked about a bunch on here. One of the most interesting speeches that Edmund Burke gives is his Birds of Prey speech, where he basically introduces, some would argue, it's a fairly novel argument in the West that says, yeah, abusing colonial subjects is bad in its own right, and we should condemn it on those terms. But we should also think about the fact that it's bad for us. It's bad for the souls of the colonists. That the British East India Company has all these young businessmen and young soldiers protecting English interests, and they're doing terrible things, and they come back having their souls deformed from being the good, normal, humble English men that they went over there. Instead, they're arrogant and more authoritarian and whatnot. And I feel like that's one of the things that's often missing in some of the broader liberal critiques, is that there is just sort of I call myself I'm a classical liberal. I'm a classical liberal plus some other things, but I'm definitely a classical liberal. And any kind of conservatism that doesn't have classical liberalism isn't worth conserving. But I think that component, that dimension of things, that what doing bad things to people also does bad things to yourself, is something I feel like it's probably in Smith. You would know better than I, but I feel like gets left out of a lot of these sort of more cost benefit analysis, libertarian analyses. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot on that in what I did, but you're right. There is some hints of that in Smith and in Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke and Smith are mainly just critiquing the unbridled power of the East India Company in India. And Edmund Burke, proposed what turned out to be a hopeless cause of trying to impeach Warren Hastings, the head of the East India Company in India, as just engaging in rampant violence and monopoly in the trade area. And Adam Smith really addressed the same critique of the East India Company. But, I think you're right. I think what you're saying is very plausible. But having said that, I think it's important to be clear that this restraint on violence is not a claim that it's really not in the self-interest of the conquerors. I mean, you might be right about their souls, but as far as their material interests, the conquerors did reap enormous benefits. The slave owners did reap enormous benefits, material benefits. So this restraint on violence is not self-enforcing. There's very large groups, maybe even the whole European society, that are benefiting from conquest. So Smith and Burke were formulating this as a moral restraint that, based on not be hypocritical, do not deny rights to others that you have for yourself. And that moral, what during the abolition of the slave trade, the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson celebrated the moral boundaries on our commerce. So this idea that commerce, in order to be beneficial, needs these moral boundaries. That, no violence, no coercion, no paternalism, no saviorhood. And that was the central liberal idea, not that it was sort of in the self-interest of the conquerors to not conquer.
All right, so let's talk about agency. You put a lot of emphasis in the sort of classical liberal tradition on trade, because trade is actually, voluntary trade is a great sort of die marker for agency, because you're making choices about what you want, right? And all that.
That's extremely important, John. If you don't mind my interjecting.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Right. I think that's the other way in which economists played a big role in this debate. You might say, what are economists doing? They're amateur political ideologies and morals. Why should we listen to them? But Adam Smith also formulated an economic answer to how you could meet the demand for agency, for having the right to consent to your own progress. And that was the idea of markets and trade, that exchanges and markets had this beautiful property that both sides can benefit. Both sides are choosing and consenting and acting in their own self-interest, but still benefiting each other by engaging in a voluntary trade. That you, as Adam Smith said, you have something that I want, I have something that you want, and we both benefit by making that exchange, and we're both better off. So that's kind of the most important economist answer to how to have agency and consent, was having markets, having free trade.
But again, you're the expert on this. The kind of trade that you're talking about is really people to people, right? It's actual, or society to society, not intermediate. I don't know if it's fair or not to say it this way, but let's say that there's the accusation that there's a classical liberal form of imperialism too, which is to say that you can, if you take Hernando de Soto, who I admire a great deal, and I think he's right about this idea of clearing up informal property rights would help the developing world a great deal. And I know you know a lot more about that than I do. But doing that is making developing countries adhere to a Western liberal regime in a way, right? A Western liberal system. And there are people who argue that that's cultural imperialism and that you shouldn't impose Western style capitalism on these countries and all that kind of stuff. I'm not for the imposing part necessarily. But is there a way in which, to get to the better system that captures this agency through trade, you're still doing some cultural impositions on these societies?
Yeah. Once again, I'm really glad you're raising these complications. Once again, we get to the point that the liberals are a lot better saying what not to do and what to do. In fact, Adam Smith got this critique already when he was, suggesting trade with India as much more preferable than Conquest of India. One of his critics said, well, Adam Smith, do you think it's as easy to trade with India as it is to, make a trade in London? Obviously it isn't. If there's violence and expropriation of traders and lawlessness and insecurity, it's going to be very hard to trade. So liberals always are stuck with these kind of dilemmas. But I guess, again, the liberal critique is it really going to help matters to have some colonizer or have some dictator impose the conditions for free trade? If anything, that, again, it can and does and has, hurt the cause of free trade even more than the lack of free trade to begin with. When you impose free trade on another society that's not given the right to make their own choices, that generates enormous amounts of resentment, as it did throughout the history of the colonial era. And I think it has a lot to answer for as being why the post-colonial regimes often were anti-market and anti-trade. So, there are no shortcuts to getting a good answer here. People have to have the right to have the consent of the government and cannot be coerced by some outside power to have a free trade regime that they have not yet arrived at, for consenting on for themselves. And there's no shortcuts available. It doesn't help to have to try to take a big shortcut and leap to a free trade regime by using outside violence. That doesn't help. I agree there's a problem, but outside violence is not the solution.
So, the book of yours that I am the biggest fan of, that I got the most out of, was The Tyranny of Experts. And I'm just wondering, how does this book flow out of that book? Like, where are the touch points? How did writing that book make you want to write this book?
Yeah, it's very similar to what I said at the beginning of this podcast.
Yeah,
That
no, that's true. But I
the
wanted to get
tyranny of
back to the
experts
training act.
was really also at the end a big critique of the benevolent autocrat model, and it was my frustration with the way that it was so hard to make progress on that argument, and so much resistance from the development world to making that argument. I thought, wow, I and the other liberals, we need even more firepower. We need help from Adam Smith and uh, you know Ludwig von Mises and P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman and Amartya Sen on how trade is a nice alternative to outside conquest. How liberal democracy is the preferable alternative to violating the consent of the government by using state violence to impose what the dictator wants on a people without their consent. So that's really what motivated me to do this additional book that goes back into the history of why benevolent autocracy was such a bad idea in the views of the classical liberals.
So what is there a case study? Is there a demonstration effect of how you think this is supposed to work, that you can say, well, look, you don't need this violence, you don't need these impositions. Look how it worked out in X. Where's X? Like where is a place that you think provides a teaching, a teaching opportunity for how not to do things or how to do things?
Yeah, what you're saying is also a great illustration of why this is such a hard sell. The sort of it seems to be saying just do nothing, leave them alone, which the liberals indeed often did say. And that's a really hard sell. Here are these tragic problems, and you intellectuals and experts should just do nothing and leave people alone. And I think the liberals are often close to making that, and I sympathize with that argument because the doing something often does involve the use of a lot of coercion and paternalism. We know best what is good for you, how to rescue you from this bad situation you're in, and we're going to impose our solution through violence, through military intervention, or at least severe pressure from the aid agencies that make you do fulfill the conditions that we want you to fulfill for our giving our aid to you. And that is, again, it's not like liberals have an answer. Like the liberals don't say, okay, here's our magic answer that will get you out of the mess that you're in right now. They're just saying violence and outside experts using coercion is not improving the situation. It's not the solution. But people who don't have a positive solution, as I know from 40 years of being in this business, often lose the argument. Usually lose the argument. And and frankly, liberals were often losing the argument among the intellectuals for the past 250 years. It's really hard sell to intellectuals to have a story in which intellectuals have nothing to do. That's really not going to appeal to the intellectuals.
Look, I'm very one of my favorite lines from Calvin Coolidge is, if you see 10 problems rolling down a hill towards you, do nothing, and 9 will roll into a ditch before they reach you. I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. My friend Kevin Williamson tells a story about how when Eisenhower was the president of Colombia, there was a debate about where to put some new footpath between some new building or something like that. And architects said this, the landscapers said that. It was a big argument. And Eisenhower said, and it could be apocryphal, but I like the point of it anyway. Eisenhower said, well, let's wait a year and see which direction the students walk, and then we'll pave that. Right? There's a certain amount. It's great. Yeah. I mean, there's a certain amount of let markets create the pattern, and then you can figure out what to help or not help or whatever. Let people make the patterns, right? But when I think about a lot of your work, I think about the stories I've heard from people who talk about. I had a friend who did a lot of work in Africa, and he lamented that some of the really brightest young people he met were drivers for NGO officials and for UN officials and that kind of thing, right?
I know, that's really sad.
And so you have this system. I think this is the point about intellectual screwing things up, is by screwing with the biorhythms of a society to the point where, rather than starting a business or doing something incredibly productive, the best way to provide for your family is to learn English and then or French and drive some foreign bureaucrat around. That messes up societies too. And I think that there's a kind of that Heisenberg effect thing, is that the intellectuals and the experts, they change the subject by studying it, and they're kind of blind to that problem.
Yeah, I think the liberal guideline here, again, I'm always glad that you're raising more and more complications, but the liberal guideline here is doing something worse than doing that. That should be the list. So, like to give another extreme example, Frederick Douglass during the Civil War gave these kind of shocking do-nothing speeches to abolitionists. The abolitionists, and for that matter, the slave owners, were asking, well, what would you do with the slaves if they're freed? They're going to be very poor. They're going to be, very in extreme poverty. What's your plan for helping the slaves become more prosperous and better off after abolition, after they're freed? And Frederick Douglass, is shocking, and he used those two words explicitly in several speeches during the Civil War before emancipation. He said, do nothing. Why did he want to do nothing? He said, you're doing something for us is our greatest misfortune. Your idea of doing something was your stupid and toxic idea of benevolent slavery. Or another crazy, stupid, toxic idea was colonizing the freed blacks back to Africa, and that was the formation of Liberia and the colonization movement that wanted to ship, basically all free blacks back to Africa. And Frederick Douglass said, "No, thank you. We're good on our own. No, thank you for your attempts to do something for us." And he even continued that after the Civil War with critiques of plans to help the freedmen, the freed slaves after the Civil War. He said, your philanthropy once again is, imposing your broken down professors without chairs, think they're God's gift to the freed slaves and are imposing their own crazy solutions. Why don't you let us be in charge of our own development through operating in free labor markets and leading our own philanthropic efforts? We want to be in charge. We don't want you guys in charge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of one of the things I learned from Thomas Sowell was how Jim Crow was big government, right?
Yes, exactly.
The bus companies did not want the policy of back of the bus, and that was a compromise, which originally was that black people should have their own buses, and the bus companies are like, that's a tax on us. Why don't we just let customers choose, and the broader point about Jim Crow was a state rebellion against free labor markets, because so you keep people where they are so they can't sell their services for more in a different place, and that kind of thing. And I think that gets left out in a lot of the tales of these things, is that in fact economic interests are, liberalizing in the literal sense of the word.
Yeah, I think what's been neglected is sort of this liberal history of anti-slavery, anti-colonialism. And as a result, a lot of anti-segregation. And as a result, those causes were often captured by the left, by communists and extreme leftists who are proposing socialist solutions. So the liberal failure here is really tragic. That those causes, which are so important to people that were the victims of colonialism and slavery and segregation, those causes were wound up helping the left rather than the classical liberals. That's really, really sad, because there was always an alternative of liberal anti-colonialism, anti-segregation that's just based on people's right to equality of status, equality of rights. That was all along the liberal argument that could have been offered, but sort of got lost along the way, and that resulted in these causes being promoted and embraced by tyrants, by domestic tyrants in the post-colonial states.
Do you ever lament, or do you ever think that part of the problem with, in my last book, I made the argument that basically the liberalism that we're talking about, the democracy, individual rights, they're the best system ever created for maximizing prosperity and human happiness, but they don't feel like it because they're unnatural. And the iron law of oligarchy, I think, is true, right? That there are always going to be a small number of people running institutions because that's the nature of how information and processing works. Do you ever lament that the problem is that we have a sweet tooth for experts, for benevolent dictators, right? I mean, there's a reason why we cannot beat to death this idea of a strongman, right? It just keeps coming back in. Is it because we have an evolutionary sweet tooth for it? Which is not an argument for doing it. The naturalistic fallacy is not my point here. Like, for me, it's an argument for fighting much harder to keep it at bay. But it does feel like there's something in our innate orientation to want experts, a priestly caste, a strong man, a big man, to make decisions for us. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think it's another part of the do something is always better than do nothing kind of mentality. Who's going to do that something? Well, the most obvious candidate is some local autocrat who has a lot of power to impose, my brilliant, correct solution as an outside expert. So, this is why Bill Gates was so enthusiastic about Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia. It seemed that Meles Zenawi was listening whenever the Gates Foundation came along with some solution for health or poverty or agriculture or whatever. And so, of course, Gates and the Gates Foundation is going to love this. We have this very energetic autocrat willing to impose our great solution. And of course, the tragedy of that is you create political chaos in Ethiopia, which we're still seeing the bitter fruits of today. So, the problem with so-called benevolent violence is benevolent violence generates malevolent violence. And you just go into a downward cycle of violence. And, of course, the other thing is you can't really trust someone with unlimited violence to really act in the best interest of other people. They're most likely going to act in their own interests, as Meles Zenawi definitely did to assure the success of him and his party. And so that really is very, very close parallel to the colonial autocracy idea that as long as the colonizer is offering an autocrat, an energetic guy on the scene who's going to impose our preferred solutions, then that colonial autocracy is also justified. It's a very similar argument.
So is there, I don't want to, there's a kind of nice parallelism between the concept of benevolent violence and the concept of benign neglect or benevolent neglect. Mm-hmm. And part of your argument is basically it's sort of an analog to Moynihan's benign neglect. Just leave these people alone and let them figure out what they need to do to fix their problems. Mm-hmm. Is there a place? Is there a place that is having sufficient success at that for whatever reason that you can point to? I'm not saying that it's got to be someplace to emulate, but there have to be places that are doing better in this process of recognizing property rights and recognizing the importance of agency and or is it just a mess everywhere to one extent or another?
Yeah, well, you could say, let's not be utopian. Let's be content with partial solutions. So there's definitely places where there's political autocracy, but a lot of economic rights, as you're saying. Property rights are protected. There's no extreme state controls over, there's no extreme price controls. There's no extreme controls on trade in the form of extreme barriers to trade. So that place is probably better than a place that has both political autocracy and widespread state violations of economic rights in the form of expropriating property, repressing trade with violent controls, severe price controls that lead to severe shortages. And those are rights violations that obviously matter a lot, and are a lot worse than some other society that doesn't have those rights violations, even if it has not great political rights. So we could kind of be willing to kind of recognize partial solutions. But again, you can't go all the way to saying, okay, so it's all fine that there's a benevolent autocrat. As long as he, and it's almost always a he, is imposing free markets, then we're okay with it. Because again, that does, using violence to impose free markets is not going to solve the problem. It's going to generate violent resistance that's going to embrace anti-market causes often. So it doesn't really help solve the problem. But as you can tell, I keep saying negative things, and that's again why all of us in this with these intellectual sympathies are always losing the argument.
So, as I'm sure you've heard, the U.S. has cut a whole bunch of USAID, right? And there are estimates out there that this is costing. I've seen estimates all over the place, right? From tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of lives a year. Mostly it's in statistical, models of how many more people are going to die of malaria, how many more people, blah, 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 blah. Given your view about the distorting effects of aid, are you a little more hopeful than about the consequences of this, or do you think it's all folly? I mean, obviously, I think it's fair for me to assume that whatever you wanted to do with USAID, you would not do it on a whim overnight the way it was done, right?
Yeah, correct.
That said, it's like Mansur Olson says the one way to get rid of the sclerosis in a system is to destroy it with war. You don't want to be in favor of war, but right. Is there an upside here to what's going on with USAID?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep two ideas kind of distinct. And one is, what is the desirable kind of long-run state? And second, what is the transition path going to look like towards that state? So I would agree that the desirable long-run state is a world in which there's a lot less role for aid. And that world was already happening. Aid was already losing a lot of importance relative to market flows like exports and migrant remittances and foreign direct investment and all that. By the recent years, those market flows were were tens of times, 50 times the aid flows. So I think that was a desirable position. But then should you do a kind of, shock therapy? You just kind of come in with a bulldozer and bulldoze the aid overnight and don't distinguish between what's working a little bit better and what's working less well. Is that the right transition path? I would doubt it very much. I think the shock therapy approach also presumes that the experts know exactly how to do the transition, whereas a more gradual transition would be more humble, that we're going to kind of go step by step, make sure we're not creating kind of short-run chaos for kind of beneficial things that were happening. As far as your figures on, what is the damage that was created by those aid cuts? So as far as the idea that the aid cuts have led to a lot of loss of life or a lot of increased poverty, that depends on how much good you thought the aid was doing before the cuts.
Mm-hmm.
If aid was having no benefits or having negative benefits before the cuts, then you have to say, well, I can't romanticize aid just because it was cut in this vicious way. If it wasn't working, then it's not going to have these dire consequences of cutting it. And the evidence on this is kind of mixed. I think in the health area, aid did work better. And simple solutions like vaccines and antibiotics and oral rehydration therapy for babies, those things did work better to lower infant mortality rates. So I have some sympathy for saying, if you're kind of slashing those things, and also anti-malaria program, you're kind of slashing those things in a brutal way and failing to distinguish what was working better from what's not really not working. And that does cause some losses. We certainly don't have any scientific basis for the claims that were made of, how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. We don't have a firm basis for that, but I think I sympathize with the idea that you shouldn't have made such brutal cuts to something that may actually have been working.
Well, and also, it seems to me part of the liberal argument would be it would be better to have functioning markets provide these indigenous functioning markets that provide these health benefits than having, philanthropy from abroad doing it. But if the society has created a reliance on the philanthropy, which prevents those markets from being created, those institutions from being created, then cutting it off cold turkey by surprise is really, really bad. And but your point about the flows from trade being so much greater than the flows from aid is a really interesting one, insofar as it adds a moral dimension to the tariff stuff, right? Insofar as what the blanket, certainly the Liberation Day tariffs, they were not great for a lot of poor countries that we want to become richer, for their own good and basically for our good too.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. And that is much worse than whatever was going on with aid. Steep tariffs is just its own form of coercion that is preventing kind of voluntary, mutually beneficial trades between individuals, one of them in the U.S. and one of them somewhere else outside the U.S. These beneficial trades that if people were just left alone to do them on their own, then both sides are benefiting. And I think what's sad about both political parties now alternating in power is neither one seems to understand positive sum game. They're always a zero sum game about, if I'm benefiting, I need you to lose. If you're benefiting, I must be losing. So I'm going to do something really horrible to stop you from benefiting because I think I will lose if you benefit. And economists' great insight is that there are positive sum gains from markets and from free trade. That unfortunately has been very much lost for both political parties. Maybe that's the fault of some of us economists that we failed to kind of convince people that the positive sum games really were a great thing.
I mean, again, I think that gets to my point about our lizard brains being wired to think incorrectly about about some aspects of reality.
Yeah.
I remember Russ Roberts, who I know you know at least a little.
Yeah, for sure.
Russ tells this story about how early on he was interviewing or talking to Milton Friedman, and he said, isn't it great we won all these, our team, our side, whatever, won all these arguments about wages and price controls and all these things, and Friedman said, no, we didn't. What happened was, in the 1970s, we tried all of those things, and the American people hated it because they didn't work. And so, the policymakers went a different way, but like we were the rounding error on it, because like when I read you, I'm a Burke guy as much as I'm a Hayek guy, and my favorite line from Burke, maybe, or at least the one I quote the most often, is, "Example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other." Which is to say that sometimes people just have to do the thing. They have to learn the lesson. Sometimes they have to be shown. You can't tell, and that's got to be crazy frustrating for people like you, because your basic argument is, it's like, I don't want to say it's paternalistic, but it has a sort of paternalistic kind of thing insofar as it's like, let the kid learn that that's a really stupid behavior from the bump on his head, right?
Mhm.
And then he won't bump his head anymore. And if you protect him from never bumping his head, one of these days he's gonna kill himself or something like that. And I get it. It's got to be like pushing a wet noodle on a carpet when trying to talk to policymakers into doing nothing.
Well, the most powerful force for spreading freedom and individual rights is people fighting for their own rights. And I think that's what you're getting at. If there's some state controls, like price controls in the 70s, that violate people's rights in a way that they're worse off, not only in material terms, but they don't like being, restricted and coerced to not do those beneficial trades that they would like to do at free market prices. So, they do learn to fight for their own rights. And I think that's why, in the long run, the progress of freedom is positive, even though the freedom advocates keep losing the arguments with the intellectuals. People fighting for their own freedom is a successful force in the long run. It's the difficult part is trying to fight for other people's freedom. That's the hard part. Me recognizing that other people might want the same freedom that I want for myself.
So I understand it's a little bit outside of the scope of the book, but I've been on a China kick of late, and I subscribe to, and I was a young nobody in the 1990s. Now I'm a middle-aged nobody. But I kind of believed in the sort of, if China adopts market forces, markets are liberalizing. The story of, get a bourgeois, once you get a middle class start demanding for their rights and their prerogatives, and then you get democracy, all that stuff. I believed in all of that. And I have lots of friends who say that was obviously wrong. And I have to say, it certainly looks that way now, but time will tell. Right. How do you feel, given your views on economics, your views on development, about what lessons people are learning from China, and where do you think where do you think China's story is going in the medium term?
Well, again, let's be willing to celebrate partial progress. That there was a big increase in freedom in economic terms from letting people operate in markets and international trade, as opposed to Mao imposing crazy great leaps forward on them and causing a massive famine, and also the Chinese government intervening in a really obscene, brutal way with people's child decisions on how many children to have and not letting them have more than one child and all of that. So yes, there was a success in granting more economic rights, and that did pay off with the highest growth rates in human history in the economy. But no, you're right. It doesn't automatically lead to freedom in the other area, and political freedom, or broadly individual human rights, or individuals' right to dissent or protest their own government. And again, freedom is not self-enforcing. The Chinese rulers, they really did want to hold on to their own political power. They may have found it, convenient or tactically desirable to give partial increases in economic freedom, but they're really unwilling to give up their own political power. So this optimism that one kind of freedom will lead to the other, I think that really was a little misplaced.
The flip side would be that authoritarian regimes are, the analogy I always use is they're strong like marble, but marble's brittle, and so they're not anti-fragile, right? They and we could see things turn dramatically quickly in China out of nowhere because we don't have visibility into where all the stress points are. I have to believe that accepting market forces mass literacy, all of the things that came with the Deng Xiaoping reforms,
Mm-hmm.
makes China more susceptible to political liberalization rather than less. Maybe I'm too much of a Whig, but I just kind of feel like it may take a much longer time than I thought. But at some point in the future, people will look back and say, what started China on this path towards being a liberalized society was the market reforms. But I could be, and I have to have the humility to say I could be very, very wrong about that.
Yeah, well, let me have the humility to say I really don't know the answer to that question.
Fair enough. All right. William Easterly, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. The book again is called Violent Saviors, and thanks for coming on The Remnant.
Thanks, Jonah. Really great conversation. I enjoyed it.